Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for getting up bright and early with us. We really appreciate it. It looks like it's going to be another beautiful day here, and hope everybody's having a great time at the Aspen Ideas Festival. My name is Vivian Schiller. I'm actually part of the Aspen Institute. I run a program called Aspen Digital, and our focus is on all things at the intersection, or on some days it feels like the collision of technology and information and media, including AI and all that good stuff. So I have a very fun job at the Institute, and I'm delighted to be here to talk about something that is probably the most important to me of all the topics that we cover, which is not just journalism and news, but local news in particular. So if you have been going to sessions, you would probably notice that even if the word trust is not in the headline or even the description of the session, pretty much trust is what has woven through at least all the sessions I've been in. And you may have noticed, if you've looked around our world, right now trust is at a deficit for a whole bunch of reasons that we can maybe unpack in several other Aspen Idea Festival agendas. But you not only feel it in your bones, but the data backs it up. So what do we do? So as a lifelong recovering, never recovered, but recovering journalist, I am like the proverbial hammer to whom everything looks like a nail. And that nail is news, journalism. Journalism is, I truly believe, is what will save us because when people have information and they trust that information, very key, then a lot of other things fall into place. So why, we're going to talk about that in a minute, but local news in particular is where it's at. It correlates to civic engagement, higher voting turnout, it bridges across communities. The thing about local journalists is they are your neighbors. They're not some people far away in New York City, Washington, D.C., any of those places, but they are there to support you and hold institutions accountable. So local news has been disappearing for a couple of decades now, and there's a lot of reasons for it. The numbers are absolutely staggering, but there are promising green shoots all over the country, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. How do we bring it back? So we have an amazing panel. Unfortunately, Jelani Cobb, who is the dean of the Columbia Journalism School, this will shock you, his flights were delayed, so he is not here, but he will be here for his other sessions. But we still have an incredible panel. Immediately to my left is John Palfrey. He is the president of the John D. Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, which is one of the nation's largest and most important philanthropies. They do a lot of things, but as you will hear, one of the most consequential things that John has been focusing on is local news. Next is Jen White. She is the host of NPR's 1A, which is she's an award-winning journalist, woohoo! Podcast host. She's been in public radio for many, many years. You will notice the public radio theme. I, too, came from public radio once upon a time. Finally, at the end is Breeze Richardson, who is the head of our very own Aspen Public Radio. She has a long history in public media, including having been at WBEZ in Chicago. So this is an incredible panel representing all facets. So let's jump in and stop listening to me. So we want to start by just talking about why local news. Why is local news versus all that other national news, which is fine, so important? So John, I'm going to start with you because you've been focusing on this a lot.
Vivian, good morning, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And you do have a great job at Aspen Digital, and you do it really well, so thank you. Maybe to answer your question about why local news, I'll give just two short stories. Story one is, you might wonder how a large philanthropy that could really focus on anything all around the world decides on anything to invest in, and with so many challenges, as we know at Aspen Ideas Festival, there are lots of things you could do, but one thing MacArthur has funded for a long time has been public media, and at a national level, really since our founding in many ways, and support for NPR when you were leading it and so forth. And so we did a review a couple years ago of our program, And not surprisingly, the review came back and said, yes, you should be funding public media at a national level. It's really important. In fact, it is under more stress than ever. This was before the current stress, which boo on the current stress. But in any event, uh, but it said, and there's this other thing that you're really not doing. We did some in Chicago where we're based, but the crisis in local news is bigger than you think. And this is maybe 5 years ago. And one of the facts at the time was that we were losing 2 newspapers a week in America. It's now up to about 2.5 newspapers a week in America. It was once a good business. It's now a lousy and very difficult business. And there's a need for philanthropy to support it. And it's really important to communities, as we will say in a few minutes. So a few years ago, what we decided to do is to say, actually, we need to focus on this problem and actually bring others into the fold to get more donors to support and see it as a philanthropic priority, which again, we'll get to that. But story number 2, in order to figure out how to do that when you're national philanthropy, we did kind of a whistle-stop tour, and my friend Kristen Mack and I went to places from Florida to Alaska, and we traveled with people like Judy Woodruff and others who were coming along with us to talk about local news and to try to gin up support, and it has been supported. There's a wonderful initiative called Press Forward supporting efforts in 40 different parts of the country. It's very exciting. But one of the people that we met in these tours was a rancher, and this was in Texas, and the gentleman was a very devoted right-wing conservative, and maybe not the kind of person in his kitchen that you would have thought would be necessarily focused on local news, but he was passionate about it. And in fact, this is a story told by others in other places, but it was so meaningful, which was he was focused on the fact that there was no place in this generation for the kinds of pictures and stories of the family being told in the community. And it was making him emotional. And he brought out to the kitchen table pictures of his son catching the football, in this wonderful way, and, a daughter in a play and that kind of thing in the local newspaper. But the local newspaper was gone. And he was saying, how will we know? How will we record this? What will we bring out to the kitchen table years from now if we don't actually have trusted people in the community telling local news? So anyway, I think story after story tells us this is the kind of thing that can bring us together, particularly in this divided time. So many reasons, and I think it does tie back to trust.
Yeah, and that. So I want to build on that a little bit with you, Jen. So you host a national public radio program, but everything about public radio is tied into community. We're going to come to that in a little bit, Breeze. But Jen, just talk about how local news is positioned to address local needs. And also, I think John said something very interesting, which is, which we know from the data is true, but also you probably just know from your work is true, that it can cross partisan divides.
Yeah. So I think it may be helpful to cast your minds back maybe 20 years, maybe more, and think about what evenings were like where you lived. Because my memory growing up in Detroit, if you went outside at night and you'd pass houses, you'd see flickering lights. And those flickering lights represented households watching the evening news, the local evening news. There was this shared experience. Now, you may have your favorite anchor, but there were usually about 3 choices where you lived. But there was a shared experience. We were getting information collectively and then having the opportunity. I remember overhearing conversations my parents had with neighbors or with people at church about what they heard, but they all heard the same thing. Now, they may have different opinions about what that information meant for them, but there was a shared experience. Now, local news is positioned to build trust with audiences in a way national news just can't. Some of that has to do with presence. Some of that has to do with relationship building, Breeze. You know, a lot of what we do at the local level, and I spent my years in public media in local newsrooms, 1A is produced out of a local station, but it takes so much relationship building, not just to get people to trust you enough to share their stories with you, but the community is also best positioned to tell you what they need, what kind of information they need. There's this really innovative project in Detroit called Outlier Media. And a former colleague of mine developed this idea when she was on a fellowship. She saw that there was an information gap in Detroit. Detroiters were not able to connect to the sort of publicly available information that they needed. That can be really difficult to navigate. And so what they figured out was that there was really a low-tech way to develop a newsroom and connect Detroiters to public information. They use text messaging. So people could text them and say, hey, I'm trying to figure out the taxes that are due on my home, and I don't know how to do that. And then they had journalists who could do that research and communicate directly back to Detroiters. But the community told them what they needed. And then the newsroom at Outlier was able to step in and close that information gap. We can't do that at the national level. We can't do that at the national level. It's too big. So, I mean, I think, Breeze, this is a great time for you to step in and talk about what you're doing here in Aspen.
So I've been asked a lot about with the prevalence, the availability of so much news, why do we need a local newsroom? And the answer is distribution is not the same as production. Jen's team cannot give resource to how our citizens are feeling about the entrance to Aspen, what the integration of wolves is looking like in Pitkin County, who's running for office, what ideas they want to bring to the table. What happened yesterday with wildfires closing I-70 and calling for evacuation in Glenwood? That's production of the news. And we need journalists here in our community to tell those stories, to seek out those sources, to publish that information. What's so amazing about the NPR network is that our stories don't live and die here. Over the last 2 years, more than 25 stories told by Aspen Public Radio reporters have aired nationally on NPR, to tens of millions of people hearing about our solutions to problems, about moments of joy from our community. And it's that intersection, that interplay of stories from Maine, from Texas, from Oregon that show up on our airwaves, and then the dissemination of our stories to their local affiliates that I think is really what makes something like the unique NPR network really special. But the reporters in our newsroom, like Jen said, build relationships every day. We think especially in radio because our medium is very short. You know, a full radio feature in segment D of Morning Edition is approximately 4.5 minutes long. And that's long for us.
That's very
In a newscast, which is about 2 minutes, those of you who listen to the show know we have a newscast at the top of every hour, and at 04 on the clock, you hear, this is NPR News. In some hours of the day, there's a dramatic pause, and then that person keeps talking. Other hours of that day, that dramatic pause is the cue for our local anchor to take over. And we fade down NPR and we fade up the local microphone at the Red Brick Center of the Arts, where Aspen Public Radio has been located since the 1990s. It's a 45-year-old station, community-held licensed, funded and supported and nurtured by this community. And we tell the local news. And that's about 2 minutes long, and it usually covers 3 to 4 stories. So the only way we can follow an issue and really tell that story is to do it serially. Day after day after day, bite at that apple a little bit more to unfold that story in all its angles and diversity. And then, of course, the digital age has changed things for us yet again. So we serve about 18,000 weekly listeners, radios measured in weekly cume. And those are people driving up and down this valley, commuting from one place to another, going about their day. We know a vast majority of our listening is still car-based. But especially in a community like this, where car culture does not dominate our lives. Last year, Aspen Public Radio rolled out an app. You can stream the station from anywhere. And we also produce a local daily podcast. So all the times we open the mic, which is usually about 8 to 10 times each morning, gets repackaged and put out in that digital space where now we're serving even more.
And can I just add something to what you just said, Breeze? So often I'll see on social media someone post, they'll tweet or X or whatever you call it these days, and they'll say, why isn't the media talking about this?
Yeah.
And they will link to a story produced in a local newsroom, like Aspen Public Radio. So it is being covered by the media, but what they mean is, why isn't cable news talking about this issue? And I think what people miss in that is the fact that cable news may drop in and do a story about this thing. Oh my gosh, look what happened here. This is terrible. What are people going to do? And then you never see it again. Local newsrooms follow that story over the days and weeks and months, sometimes years. You look at the Flint water crisis when I was still in Michigan. That was a story that didn't play out over a number of days. It's still playing out now. National news is not positioned to provide that sort of long-term coverage. Local news is.
Yeah. All right, so we've just spent quite a bit of time talking about how incredible local news is, how important local news is. So yay, we can all go home. But wait, there's a problem. There are tremendous threats which are varied to local news. And so I want to unpack those a little bit. I'm going to come back to you, John, because first of all, because there are unique threats right now to public radio, but hold that thought. Public radio and public media is incredible, but there is a lot of other wonderful new local news that is springing up all over the country, and they are trying to figure out how they can survive. You know most of those. So talk a little bit about what are the threats for these news organizations to be able to keep going or even start.
Just so everybody has the same data point that we were talking about, which is that if you are not aware, there's a very big risk to the CPB, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, federal funding. And if that goes away, it's not to say that this goes away, but it's really bad. So anyway, this is not a lobbying thing. I'm just putting that on the table, and it will just put more pressure on the rest of us to pay for it because it needs to exist for all the reasons we know. So I just make sure that was explicit. But I think, so when I think about philanthropy, on the one hand, is it a problem in the world? Yes, there's a problem to be solved. But the other is, are there great things to invest in? So I am super excited about this topic because not only is there a problem we have to solve, but there are amazing things to fund, and there are amazing partners to do it with. So I talked about this a little bit in my first answer, but the structure of funding local news, I think, shouldn't just be national funders funding national organizations, but actually getting local and seeing what's good. So most of the structure of this thing, Press Forward, I described, is actually done with and through community foundations. So I see my friend Nicole here, who runs the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, which, by the way, is one of the largest philanthropies in America, like $16 billion. They're gigantic, but they're really close to the community in Silicon Valley, and there are news needs there. So the best way, I think, to find what's exciting is to go to places and see what's Bree's up to. How is she innovating? Outlier, something MacArthur funds, is a fantastic example. And their thought was, what if we use text messaging for people who are on text all the time? They're not necessarily driving around their cars listening to NPR all the time. Some are, but that's not the. But everybody is on their phone, probably right now, like Nicole might have been a minute ago. And if you send her text at the right time, she can get the news and information that she needs, and it will link into these wonderful community-oriented, connected, valuable bits of information. So I have been struck in my philanthropic travels that this is an area that is the most undercapitalized in some ways. So there's just too little money out there, more good ideas, and really in 50 states across America. And we do have to solve a very challenging business model problem for the way that we get and produce and disseminate and access local news. All those things are true, but there are a lot of ideas out there to support, and they're popping up like really beautiful green shoots across America.
And it's not, while philanthropy is crucial, it's not just about philanthropy in terms of the business models for these news organizations.
We don't have enough money to do it as philanthropically. We all, by the way, if you are not subscribing and being a member and all the rest, you have to do it. Fewer people are actually subscribing. So there's that. The advertising market, of course, is the challenge in a way because ads have supported the sort of two-part model of subscriptions and advertising for most media. That has fallen apart. So those are still there, but they're just not enough of that. And there's a lot of work being done. Could you make self-sustaining, maybe slightly profitable organizations? I would point, for instance, to the legacy black press in America is largely for-profit, and a lot of it for 100 years has been sort of barely scraping by, but making it work. That's where a lot of the energy is, and actually nonprofit news is a teeny, teeny sliver.
Yeah, it's an important distinction. There is, for-profit and non-profit. It doesn't really matter so long as the organization is sort of civically minded and that their primary interest is in the public's right to know.
And that they can be sustained or
exactly.
sustain themselves to some degree with a mix of funding.
So the interesting thing is, I'm going to come back to public radio, has always had, in fact, long before, even while local newspapers were thriving still with the two model, just advertising and circulation, public media has always had a wide variety of, of funding sources. So whether it is, sponsorship, which is somewhat akin to advertising, whether it's listeners like you, you've all heard those messages, other kinds of philanthropic support, more of that. But part of it has been, and still is at this moment, federal funding. And so I want to come back. John teed up this, the current threat to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is the means through which money is distributed. And Jen, maybe you can just talk a little bit about how that works, the national and local, et cetera.
Right. So it's a little complicated because you may hear NPR, the mothership, say, "Oh,
That's what we call it, the mothership.
we call it the mothership."
We called ourselves a mothership when I was there.
Say that they get very little funding from CPB. But the way the model works is the federal dollars go to CPB. CPB sends that money out across the network to local stations across the network, and most stations use that money then to pay for programming that is distributed through NPR and other publishers. And so I'll use our station as an example. WAMU gets roughly 4% of our operating budget from CPB. Doesn't sound like a lot of money. However, 10% of its operating budget comes from licensing fees for 1A. So if stations suddenly don't have the money to pay for programming, it's not just that WAMU loses that 4% of federal funding. They also lose the money we're able to bring into the station through the licensing fees for 1A. But then you look at stations like Heat in Northern California. They serve, I think, a couple 100,000 people. That's a station that relies on closer to half of their operating budget, I believe. They rely on federal funds for that support, and they are servicing an area where people don't have access to broadband. So it's not just about the news and information, it's about emergency information. So the effect of the rescission, there are some stations that might be okay, but the stations that are located in the most vulnerable communities, in the most underserved communities, they will be hit the hardest. And it will be devastating because sometimes that public radio station or that public television station is the only local source of information they have access to.
So Breeze, I want to turn to you. I'd love you to share a couple of things. First of all, I think it'd be interesting for folks to know what percentage of your revenue comes from the federal government. But also, I'd love for you to, just to the extent you can talk about it, you're probably somewhat limited, just to talk a little bit about the lawsuit and what the status, what it is, and what the status of that is, and also what the status of this rescission is. Thank you.
So Aspen Public Radio's total budget this year is about $1.9 million. And a little over 10% of our revenue comes from our Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It's called a community service grant. So that's about $210,000. So that's what's at stake. We're dealing right now at the federal level with both rescission and appropriation. And since the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, federal appropriations for stations like mine happen 2 years in advance, which all of you business owners can understand the thinking there. That money is secured, you know it's coming. And so that is currently the case. Funding for fiscal 2026, which begins on October 1st, was approved 2 years ago. And funding for 27 was funded last year. And the current administration, or excuse me, the current Congress is entertaining a funding proposal for fiscal 28. What rescission will do is claw back monies that have already been appropriated for fiscal 26 and fiscal 27 and say that approximately $1.1 billion is off the table. And so, unfortunately, that ask has passed the House and is currently in the Senate. So to whatever degree this morning leads you towards advocacy for your local station, letting your senator know, letting any senator that you have a relationship with know how you feel about funding for public media is pretty critical right now. The lawsuit, for those of you who don't know, the president issued an executive order back at the beginning of May that declared no funding for NPR or PBS from that moment on. And what we felt, and my co-plaintiffs felt, is that that limited our free speech. The viewpoints that we choose to air on Aspen Public Radio, the programming we choose to acquire, we buy 1A, we're members of NPR, we buy Morning Edition and All Things Considered, that was a decision that this independent, locally owned radio station had the right to make. And by prohibiting us from spending our dollars on NPR programming was a violation of our constitutional rights. So we are currently plaintiffs in a lawsuit along with KSUT Public Radio, which if you've ever spent time in Ignacio, looks a lot like the community Jen just described, highly reliant on federal funding. The radio station was founded by the Southern Ute tribe. It sits today in service to the Four Corners, including the Ute Reservation, and us, so 3 in Colorado Public Radio. So 3 local affiliates joined with NPR and sued this administration for our right to air the content we choose to air.
Great. So we want... by the way, Senator Hickenlooper, it will be here. In fact, he already is at Aspen Ideas. So you are welcome to all just like stop him as he's walking.
Guy's getting his coffee.
Yeah. Although I suspect we know what side of this he is on. So we're going to turn to questions in a few minutes, but we've been talking about the ability for local news organizations to continue to be able to serve the public. We haven't talked about the public yet. So we think of this as a supply side and a demand side, like in any business. We've been talking about the supply side, but not the demand side, which is what is the demand? What is the current state of the desire for journalism that is rooted in evidence-based reality? Because sadly, there is much stuff out there, I'll just call it stuff, that is not. And what do we do without that demand? Then, of course, the supply is meaningless. So I'd love all 3 of the panelists just to talk a little bit about how we address that, the demand side, which has everything to do with sort of polarization and in this country. John, do you want to say a few words?
Sure. I'm obsessed with the demand side because I think we appropriately have focused on how we do the journalism well and how we serve communities, and all that is absolutely right. But I think we've under-focused on how people are actually getting their news, and particularly generationally. So we know that those who pay for newspapers are now much older, 65 and older by and large, and so forth. So I think focusing particularly on younger audiences and how they get their news and how we meet them, Outlier, again, is such a good example of that. Yeah. I'll give a particular little anecdote. In my travels trying to support this, I've met often with groups of graduate students in journalism. Brilliant, wonderful, fascinating people, and they have fewer jobs that they're going to go out into. They're going to be paid less. They have a lot of loans. Often they'll have 6 figures of loans, and they might be looking at good jobs in nonprofit media that pay $35,000 or $40,000. That's sort of how they describe the economics of it. So tough output. And one of the questions I've asked the group is always, will you tell me about your own media diet as a graduate student in journalism? And of course, they describe often getting the news from social media, not all that surprising. And sometimes they'll use sort of an institutional subscription to some great thing, or maybe listen to a favorite channel. But then I'll say, so what do you actually pay for? Like, set aside, what are you actually paying for? Not what somebody else does or the institution. And how many use Hulu? 100%. How many have a Prime Video? 100%. How many have Max? Whatever. How many actually pay for, subscribe to a newspaper of any sort? And I have yet to find in this a single person paying in graduate school for journalism of that sort. But lots of Max and HBO and whatever. Okay, so then there's the conversation. This is not in any way shaming. It's just to say light bulb goes off in the conversation. So I'm thinking, who's going to pay that salary that you're concerned about that is then going to repay your loans? If you're not, who are you counting on? Over 65s is a bet. Not the best bet, and we just sort of have to figure this out. And and all those subscriptions on your credit card bill, like at least one of them, it would be great if it were one of these NPR stations, or it'd be really great if it were your local newspaper. But we find that the data in Chicago are that 70+% of people think that it's important to fund local news, but that they think it's in pretty good shape financially. And I think at the last data it was 14% in Chicago were paying for any kind of news. Yeah. So there's a huge gap in both how the news is being obtained, who's paying for it, and why. And that's something we have to solve for, because I think if we don't have some version of that economics to work, we're in real trouble.
Breeze, what percentage of your listeners give you money?
We're pretty right on the nose average, about 10%. 1 in 10 listeners contributes to Aspen Public Radio.
Yeah, and that is the national average, and it has been that case, and not just for public radio. That sort of range, 8 to 15%, for news organizations that don't have a hard payroll it has been like that for a very, very long time. Jen, in your travels with your show, talk not just about the willingness for people to pay, but sort of, are you seeing any kind of degradation of sort of interest in, like I said, evidence-based journalism?
This is something I think about a lot, and I haven't come up with an answer for how we fix it, but I think there's this deeper discussion we need to have about the fact that these days information is cheap. Not good information, but information. It's cheap. And when public media was first created, it was around this idea that everyone should have access to information freely. So even if you don't give to your local public radio station, when you go to the radio or when you go to the website, it's available. You're never going to run into a paywall. They might ask for your email address so they can sign you up for a newsletter, but you don't have to pay. That was the conceit. But what we've seen over time with the introduction of the internet and social media is that it feels like there's so much information out there, but who's vetting it? Who's doing the fact checking? So we've devalued reliable information because now everything is media. Right? The media, we hear it all the time, but what are you really talking about? Are you talking about X? Are you talking about TikTok? Are you talking about public media? Are you talking about cable news? It's all gotten lumped in together in a way that is not healthy. I don't think it's healthy for our democracy. It's certainly not healthy for our media ecosystem. And so I think there's this deeper conversation we need to have about the breakdown in media literacy, the breakdown in civic engagement, and how those two things connect. How do we, either through transparency or having more discussions like this in public forums, help people understand that not all information is good information? Yeah. And that if you want good information, there is a cost attached to that. Now, I can't speak for the salaries of people who work in cable news, but what I can tell you is that most public media journalists will tell you they don't make enough money, but they do the work because they believe it's important to serve their communities. But as the model continues to break down, how do you convince a young person to go into journalism? Because they're not going to work for free, and that's completely reasonable.
Of course.
Yeah. So there's a deeper conversation we have to have about it. I don't know what that looks like. And in this noisy media environment, I don't know how to make that breakthrough, but it's necessary to solve this problem.
Certainly, in part, starts with making sure people understand the economics. Not that you want to give them a lesson on business models, but that journalism is not free. Mm-hmm. And so everybody in this room, I suspect, unfortunately, we are preaching to the choir here. I suspect, but we do need more education around supporting local media. We want to.
The choir always needs practice.
Vivian. Yes. Oh,
remember. Yes.
You've used that line before.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah, go ahead, and then we want to go to questions.
I want to evoke 2 solutions.
Okay.
As we turn to questions. The first is collaboration, and I guess I should say it, and it has 2 sides. So the first is collaboration in content creation. So we cannot afford to just be competitors anymore. Those of you in the room today who are fellow locals know we are privileged to have an incredible local media ecosystem here. For those of you visiting, we have 2 free daily newspapers. We're one of the last cities in America. that has 2 free daily local newspapers. We also have a weekly Mid-Valley paper that produces in English and in Spanish, thanks to a coalition of newsrooms who contribute their English language journalism to professional translation to then appear in a weekly print publication, including Aspen Public Radio. And we also have a paper Down Valley. We have an award-winning ProPublica model nonprofit journalism organization called Aspen Journalism. And we have My Newsroom and another nonprofit in KDNK down in Carbondale. So we have an incredibly rich media ecosystem, and we work together. Yeah. And so, for example, I have 2 reporters who are full-time reporters at the Aspen Daily News who have their incomes supplemented by also working in My Newsroom and contributing that same content that they have become experts on, covering the city of Aspen and Pitkin County and delivering that over the airwaves. Second is how we collaborate as funders. And John knows this all too well. We need to get together and work collectively. In the last 6 months, my team and I have raised nearly $500,000 to support 4 desks, the 4th of which we're announcing here today, and that's a desk focused on climate.
Yes. Great.
So we have now employed a full-time journalist in our local newsroom to tell the stories of climate change, how it's impacting our community, and what solutions we're working towards solving those problems. And that funding is coming from 4 nonprofit organizations in this community who support the idea of climate journalism. The Aspen Center for Environmental Studies, ACES, the Farm Collaborative, who's here in the room with us today, Mountain Bio, which is a new Mid-Valley initiative to raise awareness and funding for climate initiatives, and the Global Warming Mitigation Project. And behind each of those nonprofits is a major donor who said, I want you to work better, stronger together. And on our arts and culture desk, we're privileged to have our community foundation in the room. Erica Snow here at the Aspen Community Foundation supports our arts and culture desk in order to lift up the profiles of nonprofits working all throughout our community. So if we can work together, we can work better and stronger and have journalism, local journalism, be at the root of that work.
Thank you. This is how change happens. So thank you. All right, let's go to your questions. Woo. We've right up here. Sorry, the mics. Wait for the mics. And if you could please say your name and, if relevant, your affiliation or where you're from.
Okay, my name is Todd Chamberlain. I'm the executive director for the Sopra Sun Sol del Valle, which is the local Spanish newspaper here in the valley. Oh. And we are a Press Forward grantee, and I would have to say we could not reach a Latino community without the support of philanthropy and donors. And in today's world, it means so much to that community. And we have an amazing staff of 3 Latinas that are creating content in Spanish, native Spanish, talking about our local community. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Okay, questions on this side. We have a gentleman just over here in the hat.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that gut check around all of the subscriptions. And
it wasn't aimed at you, trust me.
No, I have a couple of questions, and they're different, but I'll combine them for the sake of time. One question is, you don't want to plan to lose or fail, but what becomes the contingency plan if your lawsuit doesn't go in your favor? Like, what then becomes the, I guess, B and C strategy of that work? And then you talked about philanthropy, and my question is beyond, I guess, funding. What are other ways that philanthropy can show up in this fight?
Oh, great questions. Breeze, you want to take the first one?
Yeah, and as I look around the room, I have to call out the shoemakers who founded the nonprofit or the fundraising initiative and doing so much work, Mountain Bio, and we have women's desk funders here in the room as well. That's my answer, is if I lose federal funding, I will turn to the community who supports this radio station, and I will ask for their support. We launched back in March the first women's desk in the NPR network. We crowdsourced that from women that we approached and said, will you fund a full-time reporter to center women's voices in the telling of local news? And they showed up only almost double what our goal was. And so I trust that this community, I'm of privilege. This community is going to say that the presence of local news, this incredible trajectory of growth that we're on, is important, and they're going to show up for it.
Jen,
And
do you have that level of optimism for other parts? And then John, will turn to you on the philanthropy.
I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't, right. When we talk about communities that are serving smaller populations, less wealthy populations, the prospect of losing that funding looks really different. We were talking to the head of the Alaska Public Media Network, and he estimated, was it half? Half of their stations, if this rescission bill goes through, half of their network would shut down.
And that's why conversations like this are so important, because there are stations look like me, but there's a lot that don't. And I have the opportunity to be on this stage. So I need to lift up and bring attention to this issue so that as a nation, 99% of America receives a public radio signal. We need to keep that access to democracy and civic engagement alive.
Thanks. John.
Thank you for this great question about what philanthropy can do other than dollars. To be clear, give the dollars, right? And actually, and give more of them. So one of the things we're doing at MacArthur is we raised the floor of our giving from 5% to 6% this year because there's more need out there. So I think we can all do that. Like, take out your wallet, whatever it is, like put 20% more out there in a time where there's that need. But there are other things. We have other assets. So one thing I've thought about with local news is there's giving money, but then there's also, can you take costs out of the equation? So could you actually have shared space? Rent. So in Colorado, this collab, right? That's an example where we're doing something similar in Chicago. So can we have people take that rent check off of the, what their costs are? Two, how do we share knowledge across these different things? So when I mentioned the Silicon Valley Community Foundation or the Aspen Community Foundation, if the point is we're doing the work locally, we have to share the successes across, right? There's real value, I think, in creating that network. So Press Forward, which began with 3 donors and is now 88 donors and started with 0 chapters, is now about 40 chapters. Actually, the network and knowledge of that, what's working in Detroit, might or might not work in Alaska, but I don't know, maybe the text messaging thing is really helpful, et cetera. But something that's working in a small town in the borderlands might work in the Four Corners, right? So there are all sorts of things I think that we can do in terms of knowledge sharing and that kind of thing. And the last thing I'd say is just spotlighting. So I think by philanthropy saying we're funding this, we are funding local news for MacArthur for the first time ever, and we think other people should do it. It's a little like what my friend Marlise does with the MacArthur Fellows Program. When we shine the spotlight on a landscape architect, and that, the amazing Walter Hoods of the world. And so the people who do it are, that field is elevated alongside the incredible scholars, the incredible artists, the creators. So I actually think by putting a light on a topic, we can't lobby, but we absolutely can say to all the people here, you should focus on this topic, you should give money with us, and I think that's one of the things we can do well.
And
I want to take, sorry, go ahead, Jen.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I'll briefly note that national media has a role to play here, too. We have a series on our program called Local Spotlight, where we elevate local investigative reporting for exactly that reason. So even though we're a national station, we can still connect communities across the country, but we don't fly in. We have the saying, nothing about us without us. So if we're talking about community, we're going to tap into that community and then let them tell their own story to the country.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. All right, I think we probably have time for one more question. Let's have somebody in the back. Yeah, sure.
I'm Gil Chrisberg from Jacksonville, Florida. I'm involved with local news. And I'm a political independent, but I remain concerned from what I hear in my community that people still think it's left-leaning. And I'm wondering what your response to that is. How, are you trying to change that perception?
Sorry, just a clarifying question. When you say it is left-leaning, do you mean public radio or all news media?
Local news.
Any local
in
news?
In addition.
Yeah.
But also even NPR.
Yeah.
Kelly McBride, who's NPR's public editor, she's independent. She's the ombudsman. I guess that's the easiest way to say it. She recently did an analysis of like 100 news stories over time of NPR. And of those 100, there were 2 that she found that were actually, there were some maybe editorial decisions here that could have been made differently. And so I think this is a reflection of the media environment we exist in, that shared experience around information. We don't have that anymore. We are able to self-select our media bubbles. And so when something doesn't align with our beliefs, it's jarring. It's jarring because we don't have that shared experience anymore. Now, we go through a very rigorous editorial process. I think in every local newsroom I've been in, the amount of hand-wringing that goes over getting it right. But I think the responsibility we have is to be more transparent with the public so they understand that process. If you don't know how we came to the decision about how we tell a story, and you have a feeling that something isn't quite right with it, maybe understanding how we got to that point can help dispel some of that distrust. So I think part of the answer is about increased transparency with the public.
I will say in closing, because unfortunately we're out of time, I can tell you that the conversation, that your question and the things that Jen was just saying, those are conversations that are happening in every newsroom in America, from the New York Times to all of the press forward local stations. How do we make sure that people trust us, do not perceive us as biased, and we give them the information we need? I want to thank so much John and Jen and Breeze and all of you. Support local media. Thank you.